and Vexed, a Bailey Bay Cozy Mystery. Bailey Bay Cozy Mysteries, Book 2. Written by Catherine Waltan, narrated by Allison Liu. Chapter 1. The air in my home country was rich as usual. Butterflies in different colors from neon pink to poison green and aquamarine blue drifted lazily in the fingers of the warm afternoon breeze. I was in the scarlet meadow with my mother. We twirled in the grass and smeared soil on our faces and clothes, like we had seen the humans do on television when we visited the human realm. Although it had been under different circumstances, I sure missed the human world too. But nothing could beat Draenen in the aspect of how nature loved us. Even the lone willow tree had thick vines wrapped around it, and it cast a shadow on the tulips, making them all the more beautiful. Tulips had bloomed the night before, and I had caught the dew on my fingers and watched it trickle down my hand. It was soothing and cold, like the droplets under the large mistletoe tree back in Saint's Crest. The red petals were like flames, mingling with the yellows and greens and forming a patchwork of the most beautiful piece of nature I had ever laid my eyes on. I sank to the ground and allowed my nature magic to flow through me. I felt at peace for the first time in a lot of long years and attuned to the earth. My magic sank into the earth, fluid like a horsewhip. I felt like a dormant seed and pushed my magic into the seed cover, urging it to come alive. I felt it crack and struggle, making its way above the soil before it finally became a bright yellow flower and the petals swayed in the breeze. "That's beautiful," my mother said, and her heart warmed at her voice. It felt like ages since I had seen her this happy and carefree. She looked ageless in her beautiful yellow dress, and I watched as she took a few steps backward and began the dance of the fiery sun. Her body twisted and turned, arching at beautiful angles. She danced with a familiar rhythm, and I felt something inside me come alive. Tongues of fire started to cover her, spreading from her chest to her arms and finally to her body. Dazzling fire of cobalt, crimson, and yellow surrounded her as she moved to her own rhythm, and the fire on her body never went out. It covered her like armor, inching across her face, and finally she stopped with a katana in her hand. It was made of fire, but it shone differently, like it was made out of steel. Her chest heaved as she took deep breaths, and for that second, I finally knew why she was called the Fiery Princess. She was regal and pristine, covered in fire as she danced, just like she danced on the battlefield during the Cold War. "Yes, that was beautiful," I said, and my breath caught in my throat. "Awesome?" She chortled merrily as the fire dissipated. Her blonde hair shone in the afternoon light like sheaves of wheat, and I always wondered why I did not get my features from her. My father was also a handsome young man, but I still pondered what drew my mother to him. They were in separate castes entirely. She was from a powerful bloodline, the powerful Laurent family known for their unstoppable flame magic. But how she got married to Nathaniel Harper, a peasant from the outskirts, still baffled me. But she had always told me that she loved him despite their differences. Now, he was only but a memory, yanked away from us by the cruel judgment of those who sat in the Draenen Parliament. But nevertheless, I would never stop loving him. I played with the rose resin petal that sat on my collarbone, held by a simple weave of minuscule vines that formed a delicate green chain around my neck, a reminder of the father I had lost. "You look downcast. What's the problem?" my mother asked, her voice almost like a whisper in the large expanse of the meadow. "It's nothing," I said, and lifted my face to look at the fluffy cumulus clouds drifting lazily and an endless ocean of cobalt. "I know you're thinking of your father," my mother said. Somehow, she always seemed to understand my thoughts with just a single look at my face. "It's going to be okay, baby," she said and drew me in. It felt awkward at first, but I sank into her embrace and shed a few silent tears in memory of my father. I also missed my proud Lazare cat, even though I knew he was away in the basement of the Laurent Manor, lapping milk or looking for rats. I missed his haughty, arrogant voice ringing in my head. The feline sound had been so relaxing, but now it felt so far away. A shrill sound tore through the silence like a knife. It rose to a crescendo quite quickly, sending all the beautiful canaries from the old willow tree. Their plumages became bright before they disappeared into the horizon. I looked at my mother questioningly, and she also arched her eyebrows in question. "It's the horn of the calling," she suddenly said, her voice carried by the wind like the song of a sylph. The horn was rarely blown in Drainan unless something terrible or good had happened. According to history, it had not been blown in the last 20 years, save for the Hecate festival that I attend each year. The festival brought us good tidings from Hecate, our matron god, the god who helped us weave magic however we saw fit. The festival usually started with prayers and supplications to Hecate, and then a spectacular magic show and a lot of merrymaking. But now, the horn's sound on a beautiful, quiet afternoon was very strange. "Let's get back to Ash Square. Who knows what might have happened," said my mother, and she took me by the wrist. I sent my magic into the meadow and cleared a path, telling the tulips to bend to one side, and the rich loam soil became our path. I desperately wanted some time alone with the soil, speaking to it and letting it know everything about me. That was the essence of my magic, to speak to Mother Earth. As we got closer to Ash Square, we started to see people also trooping in, wearing clothes of different colors. From silk to rayon and cotton dyed in the most beautiful colors like Persian red. There seemed to be no cause for alarm from the huge smiles on their faces. Magic was beautiful in its essence, and it made the hearts of people glad, just like it did mine. I still laughed with my mother as we moved through the streets of Covenvale and took a bend on Stalenfrey Avenue. Ash Square was just in sight, with towering ash trees looming over the open space. The square was known as a communion center, a place where ley lines overlapped and our magic was intensified. Together with the magic that came from the special ash trees grown in the blood of the noble Azagor stag, Ash Square was a place for a witch to channel as much magic as she could without consequences. It was also the place where we all gathered for the Hecate festival every year. I could still remember the last festival before my mother and I had to leave for the human realm. It was a trying time for me, but the cherry blossoms had been in full bloom, lending their falling beauty to the colored lights that hung across the square. The children had been assigned to groups to take part in the haunted house parade. I had declined the offer and made my way towards the stage and watched as magic melded together. Earth and water coalescing into delicate, beautiful patterns. Flame and wind formed intricate designs as they swirled together, with the air making the flames burn brighter. But as my mother and I reached the square, it was a different story entirely. She tried to cover my eyes, but I had seen more than enough. But that didn't mean that the contents of my stomach sat right with me. Amelia was just a young woman of 18, in my age group. Whoever did this to her was a monster and didn't deserve to live. I had seen her full of life in royal attire of the Maylies family, vermilion gowns over white silk pantaloons, and a brocade scarf around their necks that had the Maylies insignia emblazoned on it. Although they were keepers of relics, they were still known as one of the most powerful families ever. They held the ancient relics that gave immense and vast magic to whoever wielded the relic. The coppery smell of death filled my nostrils, and I closed my eyes to take a deep breath. Even though we were never friends, I knew she didn't deserve to die. Above her head were little scrawls that looked like doodles. It looked like no one would notice them because they were insignificant. I couldn't bring myself to lean further for fear of stepping on those beautiful but cold blue eyes. The Alabaster Corps, which were Damon's military, had trooped in, carrying vermilion flags that had the symbol of the Maylies family. The family of the deceased were in tears as magic was used to wrap Amelia's corpse in stark white linen, and right in front of my eyes, a blue fire burned from within the dead girl's body. It was serene and calming, and not like the other flame magic I had seen. A cool breeze washed over everyone in the square and calmed our hearts, and the ash trees swayed and whispered to the wind. I was at a loss for words on the magic I had seen. It was Amelia's, and it was extraordinary in its own way. Strong, but exuding so much gentility that I wanted to cry. I sent my magic into the air, controlling it and lending power from the ash trees. As the corpse landed in the grove of ash trees, it was immediately covered by blue roses that grew out of the ground, and I prayed for her soul's safe return back to Hecate, the mother of all witches. I must know who killed my daughter! The woman who I hadn't known was Amelia's mother screamed. She looked so much like her daughter, with the same slender frame and almond-shaped eyes, but her eyes were like coal instead of Amelia's intriguing blue. Tears slid down her face as she was held back by other people who were at the scene. The tears came from my own eyes as I watched her mother cry and grieve for the loss of her child. My mother's hand gripped my shoulder tightly from behind, and I was glad she was here to comfort me. I wouldn't know how to feel if my mother died. Elphus, Amelia's older brother, came to his sister's grave and used his magic to create paper from thin air. It was very slim, but looked like leather. It was a paper we all knew about, argan tree paper. It was used to find magic signatures even though it was very faint. He knelt down and placed the paper on the linen and muttered a spell I had never heard of. The paper burned brightly and shot in the air, dancing and circling before it finally crumbled to ashes. "That's her!" he said, and pointed in my direction. Silence rippled across the crowd, and Ash Square became like a graveyard. I closed my eyes and balled my hand into fists as some of the Alabaster Corps started walking towards me. In a flash, my mother was yanked away from me, and cuffs were slapped on her wrists, cuffs that I knew kept a witch from doing magic. My heart exploded in my chest, and with a burst of speed, I shot forward, but was pulled back by someone. "Don't make matters worse," a familiar voice said behind me, and I looked into the eyes of my aunt, Jessie Laurent. She held me close to her, but I couldn't watch my mother go. "She didn't do anything! She was with me all day!" I screamed and ran forward, but the soldiers pushed me back roughly, and I had scrapes on my hands as I tried to break my fall on the cobblestones. But I couldn't be tired now. I ran forward again and grabbed my mother's hands. They were unusually warm against mine, and her eyes were misty with tears. "I didn't do it, Rosalind! I would never kill a child!" she screamed, and her voice reverberated in my bones. I felt her anger and sadness, the hurt in her heart, and the pain in her hands. "I am going to find who did this to us. I will set you free," I promised, and I watched her dragged away with the glistening silver armor in my vision. Chapter 2. The crowd had dispersed in Ash Square, and the dried blood had been washed away by those with water magic. The floors were squeaky clean, but the numbers were still etched into the stones, dark and ominous. Amelia probably left it there for someone to find. Maybe a clue to find her killer. Shadow was beside me, trying to find his footing on the slippery stones while I knelt and wrote down the numbers on a piece of parchment. The sky looked just like my heart, suffused with darkness, and the burnt orange signified my determination to get my mother out of the Carftaline Manor. It had belonged to the Carftaline family, but their family line had died out a long time ago. Now, it was haunted with the ghosts of those who had lived there. To keep the spirits trapped in, powerful witches had used a large-scale sealing spell called the Gale Configuration. It was a very powerful spell that drained up a lot of magic from the casters, but was used to seal things inside the house. A few years later, it became the home of notorious prisoners throughout Drainan, and my mother was being kept in there like some hardened criminal, and I knew she was being framed for it. Although it had been a few hours, I missed my mother so much. I had asked for favors from some families who trusted the Lawrence, and I had finally gained entrance into the Carftaline Manor for a few minutes. I longed to see my mother's face again. I didn't want to lose her to something she didn't do, just like my father had been wrongfully executed just because he wanted to help Drainan. I sent Shadow back home and made my way carefully through the haunted house. The favor had not included pets. I put the paper inside the pocket of my dress and moved towards the prison. It towered above me, imposing its cold facade on my mind. The walls were crafted out of stone, and the windows were as dark as the night sky. The wind whispered and made me shiver as the leaves rattled at my feet. A yellow moon was beginning to peek out of the clouds and gave the manor a washed-out feeling. Ghost grays, washed-out whites, dark blacks. The large gnarled tree at the left side of the house had lost all the life in it and was nothing but a husk, and it felt like it would come alive like long fingers and grab me. The low gate creaked as the wind howled, and a single owl hooted somewhere in the distance. My heart lurched in my chest as I took step after step, but the resolve to see my mother and assure her that everything would be all right took precedence. But at the thought, I laughed. My mother was the fiery princess of Drainan from the House of Lawrence. There was no way anything could scare her. I was the one who was so scared, like I had been all my life. A single soldier of the Alabaster Corps stood guard outside the manor. He wore a sash on top of the armor, one that told people that he was a guard of the Carftaline Manor. It had their sigil on the gray material. It was the sigil of an adder wrapped around a lone rock. It was amazing how the sigil fit with the gray cloth. As I got closer, he opened the door to pitch darkness. But before he sent me off, he squeezed a piece of fine stone into my hand, and the cold rock resonated with my magic. "Witchstone keeps the ghost away," he said, and I walked into the pitch darkness. The air smelled musty and stale, like a loaf of week old bread. The witchstone lit up and spilled harsh white light on my path. Every floorboard creaked as I moved, and I shuddered involuntarily. I could feel something breathing down my neck, the cold air giving me goosebumps. When I looked back, it was gone. I walked up the flight of stairs and took a sharp left, trying to feel around for my mother's magic. I could feel a faint flame magic, beating slowly but surely. Then it began to beat faster, and I moved in the direction of the magic, letting the witchstone illuminate my path. I started to walk faster, then broke into a sprint when I began to hear voices whispering in the dark. The floorboards had ended, and I followed the stone floor down a dank corridor. This place could drive someone crazy. I took another left, tracing the magic to the source. The voices began to overlap each other incoherently, becoming a cacophony. I sent magic into the witchstone, and it shone brighter than before. and I felt the voices die down. So the witch stone worked on the magic of the witch. Simple but powerful technology that I never knew had been invented. My mother was in a corner, shackled to the ground. Her eyes were bloodshot from crying, and her face was white with dried tears. "Rosalind?" she said, and her cracked voice brought tears to my eyes. She looked spent, and the cuffs were still on her wrists, shutting off any magic if she decided to do some. I wrapped my hands around her and felt my warmth pass to her. She nestled in the crook of my shoulder, and her breathing eased a little. "I've been framed, Rosalind. You know I would never kill unless it was an enemy of mine, and I had been threatened with harm first," she rasped, and I made a plant grow through the cracks in the stony ground. The plant hearkened to my call, and with it, brought nectar that gave a witch strength. I tipped the nectar through my mom's cracked lips, and she took a huge gulp, downing the nectar in mere seconds. I grew more plants and fed her until the color had returned to her face and she no longer looked like a ghost. "I know something's wrong, Mom, and I promise to get you out of it by whatever means possible," I said, and clutched the rose petal pendant that rested on my neck. My magic flowed out of me, and I used it to grow a patch of flowers. As they opened their purple petals, I ordered them to keep producing nectar as long as they lived and kept a little bit of magic there to keep them nourished in the dark. With my magic, they grew like they were in the sun, strong and promising. "Something is at play here, Rosalind. I want you to keep yourself and Shadow safe." "I will, Mom. But I want you to know that no matter what happens, I will save you from this forsaken place. You will see the sunlight yet again," I said, and felt the tears roll down my cheeks. I hugged my mother again, inhaling the strong scent of edelweiss on her clothes. Even in Carftaline Manor, she still smelled like open meadows. She was strong and brave. Nothing could scare her. I was just frightened to see her lifeless body at the gallows, crowded with flies. I banished the thought and conjured up good ones. Thoughts of my mother and I after this, in the Scarlet Meadow, lying down on the tulips and gazing at the beautiful sky and the eerie shapes that the clouds created. Just the both of us, staring at the night sky from the roof of the Laurent Manor. I heard footsteps in the distance, and I whipped my head back. Something was lurking in the shadows, and I prayed it wasn't one of the ghosts that were rumored to live in this house. The footsteps were getting closer and echoed through the dark, sending shivers down my spine. I conjured magic and sent it deep into the earth. Through the cracks, vines rose and coalesced. They formed a spear, and I grabbed hold of it and felt it thrumming in my hand. It itched to be thrown, just like it had been created for. I threw the spear with everything I had, and the air whistled behind it. But just before it reached its target, it stopped midair, and the vine shriveled and became brown, with the flower petals dropping to the ground. It burst into flames, and green fire licked the dried vines before they turned to ash. "You shouldn't hurl a vine at your aunt. It's a little disrespectful," she said and smiled at me. "I'm so sorry, Aunt Jessie. I thought it was one of the monsters who lived here," I replied, trying not to sound even more guilty than I already did. She moved and knelt closer to my mother. "I know you're scared, but we're going to get through this together," she whispered to me, and I nodded. Although I had never known Aunt Jessie, ever since I had moved into the Laurent Manor, she had always been there for me like the father I never had. From what I had seen in the few months since I had moved into the Laurent Manor, my mother and her younger sister were closer than I had thought. Even though she was the opposite of what I thought she would be, I still loved her all the same. I had always thought she would be fierce and stern, but she was different, with a heart as pure as the wings of an angel and eyes so green that they rivaled the hue of a sapling. Her hair was like fire, red and astonishing. She was only second to my mother, but she had done a lot during the Cold War. She had even captured the lieutenant of the Triad. But even though she had witnessed all the gore and bloodshed, she was still as sweet as ever. She had even voted against the banishment of my mother when she had lost her magic. "Rosalind, we're going to have to work together," Jessie said, and I could see her eyes. She was holding herself back from crying, and I knew that sooner or later they would spill over. I nodded and hugged my mother so hard because I knew that for the next time I might see her, she might not be alive. This was the exact reason why I wanted to find the person that framed her so badly. My mother cannot be taken away from me this way, not when I had just lost my father. As we left the Carftaline Manor, fear lingered in my heart about the person I loved most in the world, Alicia Harper Laurent. Chapter 3. I stared at the tome in front of me and sighed. The books in the Laurent library were mostly large and as heavy as bricks. But most of them contained so much information that wanted to make my head explode. Most of them were filled with generational magic that made my insides boil. Only a fire mage of the Laurent family could use them without any consequence whatsoever. But the sight of the spells and potions made my heart sing. Something inside of me rumbled, and I felt something flow through me, a feeling that I had always kept aside. Even now, I pushed down. My mother came first above everything else, like always. The mahogany door tipped open, and in my arms was a ball of fur. I stroked Shadow's fur, making sure my hand reached the silver undertones. He purred happily, enjoying the care I was giving him. Honestly, there was nothing for me to do. The numbers at the scene gave no meaning whatsoever. They were all jumbled in my head, and a part of me knew that there was some deeper meaning. There was no way numbers could have been scrawled just above her head. But they were just numbers, and I had to make meaning of them fast before my mother was executed wrongfully. "I was looking for you everywhere," I said aloud, forgetting for a moment that he couldn't speak. Then his voice rang in my head, and it felt like he was exhausted because he yawned midway into the sentence. "I wandered around for a bit and got a full serving of my favorite milk flavor," he said and stretched his body on my hands. "Drizzle of syrup and a hint of nutmeg?" "With an extra spray of tangerine juice. It was heaven in my belly," he said, and turned over, letting me scratch his belly and play with his ears. "Whoever gave you that surely deserved a thank you," I whispered softly to his ears and blew warm air across his belly in a way that tickled him. He laughed for a bit and then suddenly went back into detective mode. This was one of the things I loved about my familiar. He was a rare gem. His back and forth switch through playful, arrogant, and detective modes usually made me want to pull him close to me so tightly that he would never be out of my reach. I found him on the streets of Emberhold, shivering as the clouds let down its children on all of Drainan. I had gone out with my father on one of his trips to nature, as we usually called it. It was one of the times we truly bonded from one nature magic user to another. It was the time he taught me how to use my magic to create objects. The time he taught me that nature magic could be harnessed for offense as well as defense. That day, we had gone out into the woods, and after a rigorous training day, we started to make our way back to the inn we always rented during trips like this. The storm started even before we could get out of the woods, but like my father, I loved the rain. The earthy smell as it touched the ground. The way it nourished saplings and trees alike, keeping them alive. People rushed into their houses and took cover under their roofs, but my father and I walked together, holding hands. The way the cold seeped into my body was beautiful and surely worthwhile. The sound of a low meow had made me turn back and see Shadow, helplessly wandering about in the rain. His black coat was all matted down, but his golden green eyes were so full of fear. I carried him with me, and we had become best friends ever since. Shadow had seen me through almost everything with his incessant complaints and satirical attitude, but it was more than enough to keep me going. "Gotten any clue yet?" he asked, and I frowned. The thought of my mother hit me like a hurricane. I closed my eyes and tried not to think about it. Shadow started to cough the same way he did when he wanted to cough up a hairball. He made some silly moves and finally spat out the wad of fur, and I let him sleep on the bearskin rug. "I've got nothing," I said, and shook my head. My heart was in different directions, which was making concentration really hard for me to do. Even when I tried really hard, I couldn't quite make sense of the numbers. By now, Shadow had coughed 4 more times and rolled on the rug impatiently before leaping into my arms again. I had to find another clue soon because, at this point, the numbers were just numbers. They could have been a child's doodle or something. I needed something more to work with. Something that gave more clues other than a stupid bunch of numbers that made no sense. I was getting close to my limits, and frustration began to set in. "Hey, Pumpkin," Aunt Jessie said sweetly, her voice echoing in the silent library. I could hear Grandma's bickering a few rooms away. I had come to love the family even though they exiled my mother once before accepting her back into the fold of the Laurent family. The Laurents were a crazy bunch, but they were as loving as anyone could ever be. When we came back to Drainan, it had been wonderful. Grandma had cried, and the feel of silk against my skin made me feel relaxed a bit. It had been months since we returned, and I had swiftly adjusted into the family. Even though I was a little awkward at first and the food had placed me in the clouds, it had been bliss throughout. "Found anything yet?" she asked, and rubbed Shadow's fur. He yawned and stretched across my lap, trying to place himself very well on my body. "The silk handkerchief," Shadow muttered in my mind, his voice sounding very tired. He had always loved the embroidered silk handkerchief I had used to clean his body ever since I had found him. Surprisingly, he had formed a bond with the cloth and sometimes said it made him feel electric. "You will just have to wait," I said back, and muttered a quick no to my aunt. I stood up from the chair I was sitting on and placed a sleeping Shadow on the rug. "There's only been these numbers I found at the scene," I said, and showed her the piece of paper that I had written the numbers on. "They look important, but we have no idea what they mean," said Aunt Jessie after scrunching up her eyebrows, trying to think. "That has been the same thing on my mind. But whoever killed Amelia needs to suffer for what he has done," I said, almost like a yell. But how Mom's magic signature got to the scene of Amelia Maylies' gruesome death was the most baffling. Each witch had a magic signature that was peculiar to them whenever they did magic. It was a way of leaving their own mark on the world for our matron, Hecate, to weave the signatures into a boundary that separated the world we lived in from that of the humans. Mom was always with me through the months, trying to make up for the time she had lost. We would visit the meadow and dance to our heart's content to the tune of the wind as it blew through the branches. It was a beautiful tune, and we unleashed our magic and let it sing through our veins. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever experienced in my entire life. Each passing day had become short, but I cherished it and held every single moment to heart. "But why would anyone kill such a sweet girl?" Aunt Jessie said, and Shadow meowed in his sleep. Something was finally clicking in my head. Whoever had killed her wanted to send a message, because no one in his right mind would harm a young woman. It was the highest order of malevolence. Maybe the Maylies had someone who wanted revenge? "They really do not have clean hands," she said, and it seemed sensible to me. I know practically nothing about the Maylies. Right now, I'm in the dark, and the only thing pushing me forward is the need to get my mom out of that creepy place. I also want my sister out of there, but there's nothing we can do if you're still confused about the genealogies of royals and Draenen, she said sweetly, and brought out one of the oldest-looking books I had ever seen from a glass-covered section on the library shelf. From time immemorial, the Maylies have been the relic keepers of the Society of Magic. All the powers of Hecate's sacred animals poured into objects that were given to huge families. But there were disagreements between the families, and it led to a power tussle that shook all of Draenen. Hecate had come to settle the fight, and then shared each relic with a family. But then, the Maylie family had suggested that sooner or later, wars would break out because of the vast power that each relic held, so they stepped up to be protectors. The 5 relics were shared according to each family's attribute, and the Maylies were tasked with keeping the relics until each family's descendant is chosen to carry the power. That's amazing, I mouthed, not wanting Grandma to hear my voice because she might come to stuff my mouth with boiled sweet potatoes and grilled turkey. So, what did each family get? I asked, momentarily forgetting about the task at hand. I had never really known much about Draenen ever since I was a child. My parents hated history, and my knowledge of history was about Christopher Columbus. The story of the society here was woven with so much knowledge that always drew me to its center. I always soaked up every piece of information like a sponge until I couldn't take in any more. The House of Miud, known for their earth attribute, was bestowed with the polecat's armor. The House of Laurent was given the phoenix crown, and Naberius was given the Triton of the dolphin, which is a potent water recovery magic that is rumored to even raise the dead in thousands. The Spear of the Tempest was given to the Nyrog family, known for their wind-style magic. And finally, the House of Raven was given the Ring of Minos, a relic for blood magic. That still doesn't explain why someone killed Amelia. There has to be more, I said frantically, and Shadow rolled over to the side. I gingerly stepped over him and back to the old book I was reading. Unfortunately, that's all I know, she said sadly. It felt like there was one missing piece of information that would complete the puzzle, and what had just been explained to me didn't have what I was looking for. So where are these relics kept? Only the keepers in the Maylie house know the location of the relics. I heard that each keeper was to care of the relic for each family. Was Amelia ever a keeper? Actually, yes, Aunt Jessie said after some thought. She's the keeper of the Phoenix Crown. And then it all came together. Whoever had killed her wanted to get their hands on the Phoenix Crown. And then the person framed my mother because she was from the House of Laurent. Anyone would believe that my mother was hungry for power because she had lost her magic for some time in the past. It was a very convincing story that I had to dispel. Someone wanted the power of the Phoenix Crown very badly to kill a keeper for it. But just as I thought, Amelia had not told her killer the location of the crown. She had been fierce in protecting the relic from falling into the wrong hands. Maybe the numbers were somehow a code. I picked up the piece of paper and turned it over and over in my head, and somehow it started to make sense. I finally had my eureka moment. I need a map of Draenen, I said excitedly, happy to have found something at last. Who knew that a little history would change my perception of everything? Aunt Jessie got me a map faster than I could say panic, and I used the numbers to make points on the map. In 3 quick points, I had found a location. "Where's this place?" I asked, and tried to position Shadow well so he could have a nice sleep. "The plains of Ashkelon," she said, and I smiled. I was finally a step closer to bringing justice to my mother. Chapter 4. I could feel myself slipping away as I slept. My mind warped and conjured images of my mother hanged at the gallows in Imberhold. I screamed and tried to tell them to stop, that I would find the killer, but it was like speaking to a vacuum. It was like my vocal cords had been removed, and no matter how loud I screamed, they didn't stop. The images became a loop in my dream, playing over and over again as I relived every minute of my mother's death. I tried to wake up, but I couldn't. It felt like my head was forcefully put underwater. My lungs filled up with air, and I choked on the darkness. I knew I couldn't lose this fight because somehow, I knew that if I did, I might be lost in this world, watching my mother taken away from me over and over again. I fought back with everything I had, struggling against the unseen force that held me like a vice. I tried to conjure magic, straining everything, but nothing worked. I had never felt so powerless in my life. It felt like everything I knew was taken away from me, and I was forced to watch it. New images entered the loop, and I saw my father beside my mother, a burlap sack thrown over their heads. They were bound from head to foot in ropes, and they were shoved by soldiers from the Alabaster Corps. Witches from all over Drainan had come to watch their execution. They began to throw stones at my parents as they were being shoved along. Bloodstains grew from the sacks, and everything in my body was set on fire. Anger bloomed in my chest, but I still choked on the darkness. The force still held me tight, and I watched as they were herded towards the execution chamber. They were set on a platform, and people still continued to throw stones, and I could hear my mother's soft cries and the chants of the people. "Murderers! Killers! Maniacs!" said the people that chanted while throwing rocks. I cried and screamed in anger and pain, begging to let everything go away, but it continued nevertheless. As I watched, my parents died by the hand of the sacred blade of execution that sent their magic back into the earth. But their bodies would never be consecrated and buried. They would be cremated, and their ashes would be scattered in the wind, never returning to live in the afterlife. It was the worst death a witch could face. The loop continued, and I was still helpless. But I began to get used to the pain and agony that I felt, and everything began to fade away. The choking feeling reduced gradually until I was able to breathe normally again. I knew something about what I was seeing was wrong. My mother was not dead yet. I still had a chance to save her before this happened. I could still fight for her life. And I was sure I would save her, even if it was with my last breath. Nothing could stop me now. I felt myself slip away from the bad dreams and then awoke, and the rays of the morning sun sent my eyes into a frenzy. The wind carried the smell of pancakes, and my stomach grumbled. But I was happy to see Aunt Jessie sitting by my bed, her eyes closed in slumber. There was sweat all over my face and my nightclothes, and I guessed why Aunt Jessie was with me. She had probably stayed with me through the night, and I smiled. She looked so much like my mother, except for the red hair and her skin. They had the same straight nose and the same oval face that looked like a fairy's. While my mother's skin was a tad brown because of the time she had spent under the sun honing her power, Aunt Jessie was a milky white like mine. It was the first time I had seen a person look so good no matter what she put on, whether ironclad or in a silk evening gown. I forced myself to stand up from under the sheets and walked to the windowsill. The sun was high in the sky, spreading warmth through the ground. I felt the growth of new plants and the opening of rose petals. It had been bliss even though there was a lot on my mind. The flowers were in various colors today, and I smiled at what I had created. I had never thought I would be able to produce beauty until now. The jasmine on the windowsill had bloomed the previous day, and now they were drooping and losing their beauty. I closed my eyes and called on my magic. I felt it flow from the deepest parts of my body and directed my power to the plant. Its petals lit up in happiness and shone with health. This was one of the things I loved to do. It was soothing to know that at least I could heal and fix the faults in this heavily diseased world. Shadow was in his cot, sleeping rather peacefully beside the foot of the bed. I wanted to put myself together and get to the bathroom, but I didn't like what I saw. I carried him off the floor, and I could feel his erratic heartbeat through his belly. His fur had changed from a midnight black to a sickly blue color. "Shadow?" I called softly, not wanting to wake Aunt Jessie up. He opened his eyes slowly and looked at me, and instantly I knew something was amiss. Shadow's eyes had changed from a beautiful greenish gold to a stark gray, as if life was fading from him. His belly was swollen, and I could see the crisscross of veins that ran through him. His heart had slowed so much that I could no longer feel it. Even though he kept looking at me like he was healthy, I knew something was wrong. Then I remembered that he had been coughing intermittently the evening before, but I was too wrapped up in myself that I didn't notice it. I had thought it was nothing but a hairball. "What's wrong?" Aunt Jessie's sleepy voice echoed. "What did you eat yesterday?" I asked, and he sensed the urgency in my voice. His voice was so low that I could barely hear it. It had no pride like it usually did. Instead, it was slurred and felt like gibberish as the words were muddled up. "Milk with syrup and juice," he said slowly. And I remembered when he told me that he had found a good-hearted person who had given him free milk that had all the things he liked. At that time, it felt like nothing was wrong. But now, everything was wrong with him. I used my nature magic, but whatever he had taken repelled my magic. I felt lost. I couldn't lose this little guy, too. He was the only person who had stood by me when all hope was lost. It was the best thing, knowing that I would have him by my side all day, and his arrogant voice would plague my mind. My magic could feel his life force fading, and it was fading fast. "I don't know what's wrong with him. His life force is fading very fast," I said, and handed Shadow over to her. She said a simple spell. "Spiritus ignis inveniet quid sit solecismus cum anima quae periunt." Fire ignited in her hands, but this time the flames were not green, but a deep blue color like the sky and the night. It felt strange, but I could feel the power in those flames that circled her hand up to her wrist. She rubbed her hand all over Shadow's body, humming a soothing song as she did. Shadow relaxed into her care, and she placed her hands on his belly. The fire spread from her hands and covered Shadow. For a split second, he looked like his normal self again. His eyes were back to their usual color, and his fur was silky as ever. But it didn't last long. As she took her hands from him, he was back to looking sickly. It's poison, that I am sure of, but what baffles me is the fact that I have never come across this kind of poison. "I'm sorry, but I cannot help," she said, and shook her head sadly. "So what are we going to do?" I asked nervously, shifting my weight from foot to foot. "He has to go back to the last place he ate and get the antidote, and fast," she said, and I carried him and ran out of the Laurent Manor in my pajamas. I ran while cradling Shadow to my chest. I kept running as he pointed directions. His breathing was so erratic, and I had never been so scared in my life. Even though he was just a familiar, he was the best thing that had ever happened to me. The calm during the storms and my sanity in times of depression. I had seen the way people treated familiars around me, like they were slaves. They were sent on missions where some of them ended up dead. I bit the insides of my cheek as I moved, urging the wind to push me forward. "Left," he said, and lifted a paw feebly. He was getting weaker by the minute, and I banished bad thoughts from my mind. If only I had kept him close, I wouldn't be faced with this problem. I would be on my way towards the plains of Ashkelon, but I couldn't leave him alone. I knew that I could save them both. I had the power inside of me. It felt like magic was building inside my stomach, bubbling with all the adrenaline that was running through my entire body. It felt strange but good. It was like feeling thick honey dropping onto your tongue. I relished the feeling as more magic continued to build up. I held on to it, letting the pressure build higher. I had begun to move faster, and I began to feel lighter. My skin had started to glaze over, like glass creeping over my skin. The pressure had reached a crescendo, and I was still trying to hold it in, but the magic just exploded from my body like a shockwave and made the ground rumble. Grass erupted from the cobblestones, and tulips grew from the ground. The stones had become loam, nourishing the plants and vines that wrapped around the houses that surrounded me. A lone willow tree had grown amidst the tulips, and a gentle breeze caressed the leaves. I looked around in awe at what I had just created. I suddenly became aware of the part of Drainan I was. I was almost in front of the Karftaline Manor, and Shadow's heartbeat had steadied out. Health had returned to his body. I had never been so happy to see his greenish gold eyes. His fur had also changed to the rich black fur that I had always detested, but now, nothing made me happier. Your face, his voice echoed in my mind. It didn't have the pride I was used to, but for once, I was glad that the slurred speech had gone away. "What?" I asked, not clear about what he had really said. "You're covered in glass," said Shadow breathlessly, his feline mouth open in amazement. I looked at my skin, and I could see rays of sun flashing off my skin. I felt warm and powerful, like I could run 1,000 more miles. I knelt down and picked a tulip, and my heart went out to my mother. Sadness overwhelmed me again until I saw Shadow's fur fading from black back to the stark gray I had grown to hate. "You're not healing," I said, and was sure he could sense the urgency in my voice. He just raised his paw, and I moved effortlessly as the wind seemed to push me in that direction. I sprinted at breakneck speed and loved the sound of the glass against the cobblestones. I took one last look at the Karftaline Manor and felt the tears slide down my face. I continued moving past the statue of Hecate and onto the border of the woods. "You sure this is where you came to?" I asked, and looked at him. I had never seen him so weak before. He was my bundle of energy, and I wanted to keep it that way for as long as I could. "But there's nothing here, Shadow," I said, and looked around, wanting to find the person who did this to my cat, but there was nothing here. Not even a shred of magic. My hope of saving Shadow was gone, and only the smell of tulips remained as I ran back home dejectedly. The glass had worn off my skin along with my strength. All I could do was fall into my aunt's waiting arms and cry. I was going to find something that would heal him. At least let him live longer until I found who did this to my best friend. I was angry, storming off to the library and going to look for my father's grimoire. There would at least be something that could help in there. My father was skilled in herb studies and was one of the people that made the best potions in all of Drainan. There was sure to be some kind of antidote in his most prized book. I even still picked up some magic spells in there that helped me to unravel a lot. For a moment, I was thankful I did not inherit my mother's powerful flame magic, but instead had gotten something better in return. Not that fire wasn't good, but nature had its perks if used to the fullest. and for some unknown reason, deep down, I knew that I had not unlocked my true potential. The grimoire sat on the desk, and for a long moment, I just stared at it. I hadn't opened the book in months. The leather had worn out, and the bind was frayed at the edges. I walked over and rubbed my hand across the smooth cover. It was soft and warm, and I felt Aunt Jessie leave the room, giving me space to think. I was nowhere near good in potion creation, but I knew that something had to be done in order to save Shadow. It felt like a normal day, with soft, furry clouds and a blue sky, but I could sense evil lurking around the corner, waiting to spring up on me at any moment. I couldn't shake off the feeling that something very bad was going to happen at any moment. But I was going to make everything work out in the end. I was so sure now that I could do it, just like my father had said that I had potential that was just waiting to be unlocked. And all I needed was to unlock that power, to merge myself with the earth and the power within. Nature controlled all attributes that existed. I could say that only my father knew about this hidden power. Those that used nature magic were very few compared to other attributes. From his grimoire, I had learned that even Hecate was blessed with nature magic. She controlled all the gods from the shadows, cloaking the world and blessing witches with magic. She was even still powerful at that. But my father had not lived long enough to find what could make a nature magic user reach his full potential. It still hurt just to think about him. The smell of bergamot, cinnamon, and olives lingered around him whenever he was home. The rich greenhouse he had built out of nothing but his own magic. The silver ash trees he had planted, tending to them and watching them grow. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I missed him so much that my eyes watered. I had never missed him that much. If only he were here. He would have held me in his arms and promised me that everything was going to be okay. His smile was enough to change my situation. As the tears hit the wooden frame of the window, it sprouted into a lone, beautiful lotus flower. Even though lotuses were not native to Draenen, they reminded me of my father, and the pain swept me off my feet again. But there was work that needed to be done. I opened the grimoire with teary eyes and sifted through the pages. The plants and spells sang to me, the words colliding and ringing in my head. It was mellifluous, and I felt the presence of my father in the room. It was like he was standing directly beside me. I took in a deep cinnamon-scented breath and smiled. I felt so alive as I read page after page, soaking up the information like a sponge. I looked up combinations and spells that could stop the flow of poison. But the diseases I found didn't match Shadow's. It felt all wrong, and I teared up again. Everything was so overwhelming at the moment. With my mother's arrest to Shadow's poisoning, I felt like my hands were tied. I had never felt that hopeless in my entire life. It felt like my world was crashing down, and I was thankful for having Aunt Jessie by my side to hold things up for me. Even though it felt like she wasn't doing anything, just seeing her face reminded me that all hope wasn't lost, that I could fight whatever was coming and win. The sudden surge of hope made me look closer at the grimoire. Everything was beginning to unravel itself as I looked closer. I began to read about plants I had never heard of before and looking up their medicinal properties. "This is it," I said as I looked at the Ethola plant. It was grown in the wild and only found far away in the mountainside. But as I read on, my heart sunk. It couldn't be used on familiars because it would mess them up, and they would go on a rampage before they died a very gruesome death. This was the second plant that I wished would work. I could grow any of them from the descriptions in the book, even though I had never seen them. It felt like the walls of the library were closing in on me, and I started to take shorter breaths. I wasn't going to solve anything at this rate. I needed to keep my head straight and clear. I closed my eyes for a minute, and without delay, I knew I had left my body. It felt eerie to be out of my body without being asleep, but it sure felt relaxing not to think about all the troubles I was facing. Surely, time was still running, but it made my head clear, and with the silence of the room, everything was perfect. I went back to reading without going back into my body. As surreal as it felt, I felt selfish leaving Shadow alone. I so much wanted to find whoever poisoned him and teach the person not to ever mess with me or my familiar again. But then my mind became hijacked by images. I could see people in a single file, ragged, exhausted, and starved. The sky was red like it had been painted over, and everyone was walking towards a large throne carved out of bones in the distance. I willed myself to go forward, but I couldn't. I could only watch soldiers from the alabaster crumbs throw small loaves of bread into the crowd, and I would watch the people scramble and fight for the little food. A little child was holding the hand of her dead mother while cuddling her half-burnt doll. I wanted to leave so badly, but I couldn't. I could only just watch the devastation that had ravaged the only place I called home. The dry, parched ground had no life whatsoever, and the gray soil couldn't even make plants grow. Then, violently, I was jerked back into my body. "This is what is bound to happen if you do not stop it," a voice said from nowhere. I whipped my head around, trying to find who was speaking, but found nothing. I became scared and pensive, but I braced myself for any attack. Surely, this must be the person that framed my mother. He must be thinking that he was doing a good deed, but I wasn't ready to allow my mother to be sacrificed. Glass covered my entire body, crawling along my skin like insects. I was in combat mode, with my head running spells over and over again for possible scenarios that could occur. "Who are you?" I said to the air, and just like I expected, I didn't get an answer. I turned around, my body itching for a fight. I had not felt this feeling before. It was like I had an intent to kill. The word murder burned behind my eyes, but right now, I didn't care what mattered. What needed to be done had to be done. "I am always with you, Rosa," the voice said, and I discerned the voice as my father's, the deep bass that covered me from head to feet in warmth. The grimoire rustled as the pages turned over by themselves. He was the only one that called me Rosa, after his favorite flower, the Rosa centifolia. I had never been so pleased to hear that voice once again. My fears melted almost rapidly, and I felt utter peace. "Dad," I started, but he was already gone, with the words, "Trust no one," echoing in my mind. Chapter 5. It had mostly been a long night with me mulling over the unlawful judgment passed on my father, and now my mother's arrest. Everything was so unsettling, and my skin crawled. I had tried everything I could, but I could only buy Shadow a few minutes of health every time I put pressure on my magic, letting it build up below my abdomen and pouring everything into him at once. The poison was very strong, and I knew that the person who poisoned him must have had a reason. Something that the person knew about Shadow that made him a target, just like it landed my mother in jail. Then, it all became astoundingly clear. The person responsible for Shadow's predicament would possibly be the one that landed my mother in the Carftaline Manor. Shadow, my right-hand man and ever-able detective, became sick just when I started the investigation for whoever framed my mother. The story became so much more clear, and I could finally see the threads that held everything in place. Find who poisoned Shadow, and I would find Amelia Maylies' killer. It was perfect. But I no longer knew where to start. Things were different now, and I didn't find the home where the person lived. It was like he just vanished into thin air without leaving any magic residue. I had tried every tracking magic I knew about, even using blood magic, but came up with nothing except the locations of the plains of Ashkelon. I had tried every magic spell from my father's grimoire and looked through every herb he had documented, but all was for naught. I rolled listlessly on the soft cotton sheets, waiting for the sun to rise and paint the skies in gold and pink. Shadow breathed raggedly on the windowsill, his breath coalescing on the jasmine petals. I wished I could do more for my best friend, but I knew that even with my newfound glass magic, there was nothing I could do to save his life. But at least I could buy him more time. Enough time to find who was attacking the family that I so much cherished from the shadows and put them in the hard hands of the law. My room was covered with greenery that swirled around the four-poster bed and crawled on the floor, with small bougainvillea petals blooming in the silvery moonlight. I squeezed the pillow in my hand, trying to coax myself into sleep, but it wasn't forthcoming. Maybe it was because a part of me was scared to relive what I had seen. Children starved, looking dejected as they walked. Skies the color of blood hung over the heads of the witches. Even though I had not made any friends, it hurt me to see the people this way. It looked like they were barely alive, drained of life and the will to live. Eyes moistened with unshed tears that held so much sadness that I could feel their anguish. The invisible force took everything from them and sat atop the throne, filling the people with fear. I had felt the sheer power that came from the throne in the distance, the power that forced me into submission and took away everything from me. The dry, cracked soil that would never bring forth any life. This was what I was to avert. I wasn't some all-powerful entity that could change the fate of Drainan. All I wanted was to have my mother back with me. I missed the way she danced, shuffling about while being one with her element. Her homemade soup of oysters and shrimps that warmed my belly and made me belch in excitement. I missed my mother so much that tears welled up in my eyes again. I had been crying a lot these days, and I knew my mother would make a jest of me when she saw my face all puffy from crying. My father's voice still played over and over in my head. I didn't know what to make of his final warning, even after I had thought it over incessantly. Everyone in the Laurent Manor, even the servants like Mitchell and Eisenhower, were all people I could trust. They had tended to my mother from when she was a toddler until she became the fiery princess. I had trusted my mother's family with my life, but my father's warning still echoed in my mind. The words, "Trust no one," still made my body shiver because of the way he said it. I missed the way he called my name also, stressing the S and making it sound exotic. I missed him so much also. His grimoire just served as a reminder of everything I had lost to Drainan, and I wasn't even prepared in the least to fight their battles for them. All I wanted was to clear my mother's name, and after that, I was ready to move out of the Laurent Manor along with the rest of the family. Amelia's eyes flashed in my mind, and I closed my eyes, remembering her face. Though she had never been a close friend of mine, she was the kindest person I had ever met. She even offered me a cookie when I strayed into their compound, lost and looking for Shadow when he ran away from home, because I threatened not to give him salmon for the rest of the month. It had been a rigorous search, looking for him in various places and slipping in and out of compounds and manors because I didn't want to get caught trespassing. Those blue eyes lifeless at my feet and blood fanning out behind her. It was the worst thing a person could do to another. I was determined to avenge her death in whatever way possible. It was the only thing I could do to make sure her soul returned to where it belonged, with the ancestors. I wanted her to finally be at peace. Just as the sun streaked in through the silk curtains, I got up and made a mental list of everything I was supposed to do. I was running out of magic after a lot of pushing magic into my familiar, and I was very exhausted. Shadow looked a little better, and his breathing was steady, at least. But his fur was still the same pallid blue, and I took a very deep breath, trying to calm myself to face what was to come. I tried to form a neural link with my mother, but nothing worked. Neural links could only be used between blood relations. It was a way to speak to one another in a kind of mindscape created specially with magic. I had created the perfect scene in my head. The place my mother loved most, the Scarlet Meadow. But something was blocking me from linking with her mind. It was probably the wards that surrounded the Carftaline Manor. I shrugged and ran my hand over the smooth, whitewashed walls and sighed when I lifted my head up to the skies. It was like any other day in Drainan. The children would probably be at the local school, honing their magic to its finest. The adults would be working tirelessly wherever they were, and some would be in the pubs, drinking themselves to a slumber. But I knew something was coming. Something that was stronger than all of Drainan combined. We wouldn't stand a chance if this evil took root. I shivered as the gory images flashed before my eyes again. Only the goddess could save us now. But there was still work to be done. A knock on my door jolted me back to reality. I had really been doing a lot of thinking these days, and one look in the mirror told me that I looked as awful as it could get. "Who's there?" my voice croaked from the almost endless crying. I dabbed my face with the hem of my pajamas and took some paces towards the large oak door. "It's me, ma'am." I could hear Eisenhower's soft voice like an old cardigan wrapping around my skin. When I opened the door, I was greeted by the smell of cake, and my stomach grumbled. I had not taken in anything since I ran out of the house with Shadow, looking for whoever stooped so low to poison him. I looked back for a second to catch his breathing before I stepped outside. At the table, I took mouthful after mouthful of lemon pound cake, forgetting to even use the proper etiquette. I dug in with my fork, scooping more generous servings onto my plate and not caring that the whole Laurent family was watching me. Grandma was chewing her food slowly, and Grandpa was putting ketchup on his grilled fish. None of my other cousins were around, so it was just us eating peacefully. "Care to chew your food more slowly?" Grandpa said, and I almost choked on cake. Aunt Jessie just laughed at my face, which I knew was probably very funny and awkward, and I had to take a few gulps of milk to push down the cake that was stuck in my throat. Eisenhower was good at whatever he made, whether it was toffee or souffle, grilled fish or boiled potatoes, apple tart or custard pie. All I knew was that he was good in the kitchen. He could make whatever food we asked for, and it sure was most enjoyable. It had been relaxing to see him work in the kitchen, kneading dough and grating potatoes. It had been one of the most beautiful experiences I had during my stay in the Laurent Manor. My mother's chair was empty, and my heart fell as I looked at where she was supposed to be seated. I tried the neural link again and met the same barrier. It felt like I was running into a force field. The wards in the Carftaline Manor were so strong that I felt like I was being shredded. I couldn't contact my mother. I wanted to know if she was doing okay. I wanted to know if the ghosts hidden in the makeshift prison had gotten into her mind. I wanted to know if the nectar was enough to get her through day after day. There was so much I wanted to know, but I had no idea how to go about it. "Something wrong?" Aunt Jessie asked in that sweet voice that seemed to be laced with magic, because it was so relaxing and took away all my fears. "It's nothing," I said, and shuddered as a cold, gentle breeze blew into the house. I had never felt so tired in my entire life. Everything had crashed before my eyes, and I was powerless against it. All I wanted to do was just slip into lucid dreams and watch myself from afar, sipping pineapple juice on a hot beach filled with golden sand. I was shaken awake by the commotion outside. I could hear Mitchell yelling and some other voices that sounded strangely familiar. "What is going on?" I asked, and then I saw him. It felt like ages since I had seen those beautiful brown eyes. In Draenen, they looked brighter, like syrup on the stack of pancakes that Eisenhower made last week. The softness of those eyes turned my knees into jelly, and I couldn't move. It felt like I was thrust in homemade apricot jam, moving slowly through the world around me. I moved closer and closer, shuffling my feet on the cobblestones. My heart raced with joy, and for the first time in days, I smiled genuinely. "Leave him," I said, with as much force and authority that I could muster, even though I didn't like to sound authoritative. It made me look like someone I didn't want to become. I tried to smile at Mitchell, but he wouldn't look me in the eye. He stared at his feet, but I guess that didn't matter. My chest raced as I took in his beautiful features. The accentuated jawline and the aquiline nose warmed my insides even more than the lemon pound cake. The beautiful blonde hair looked so much like brown, a perfect mix between light and dark that changed color when the sun shone. With a cute scar on his upper lip, he was perfect, and I had missed him so much. "Rosalind!" he yelled, storming through the front gate, but stepped back when bright green flames surged from nowhere, almost taking off his face. "Cole!" I screamed, even though I had tried to rein myself in, but I couldn't help how I felt. It had been months since I had seen him last, but it felt like decades. "You know this guy?" Aunt Jessie asked awkwardly, and I nodded. The flames sputtered and then went out. In that moment, I rushed forward and wrapped my hand around him. It was the exact warmth I needed, and he pulled me closer, placing a tender kiss on my forehead. I blushed profusely when Aunt Jessie smiled at me, and I averted my eyes, taking in the light stubble on his chin. He looked a bit older than when I had seen him last, but as the saying went, the older the grapes, the sweeter the wine. Cole was one of the few humans I met that changed my orientation about the human race. Here in Draenen, we were always taught that the human race were inferior beings, capable of doing nothing by themselves. Without any magic, they needed protection, which we saw as nothing but an opening to exploit. They were weak-willed and could do nothing in the face of adversity. They were meant to be broken and disposed of, like china dolls that had lost their importance. But all that changed when I met Cole Huxley. His persistence and determination were what spurred me to get stronger, strong enough to defy a god. But I had lost all that power when I came back to Draenen. I no longer felt the power move inside of me like a whip, coiling around my chest and threatening to spill out. Now, it was just plain old me, and I needed to do something fast to save my mother. And here Cole was, right in front of my very eyes. "Come in," I whispered, and Cole released me and pulled his little brother inside. There was no way Cole could have entered Draenen without magic. I needed to know everything that had happened in the time I had left. Grandpa and Grandma had left the room, and I told Eisenhower to bring us freshly pressed orange juice. Cole had his mouth hanging open, when he took his seat by the window. Sunlight rays passed through the curtains and shone on the chandelier, which cast a soft golden glow on Matthias, Cole's younger brother. The caramel streak on his blonde hair had become more prominent, almost covering the side of his head. He looked healthy, unlike the last time I saw him. There was a soft glow around his eyes that spoke mischief, and something else I never thought I would see in a child of that age: the will to survive. I chuckled to myself at how I had come to notice the tiniest of details, but I ignored them and tried to look serious. Cole just laughed and said, "Wipe that smug look off your face, Rose. Frowning doesn't really fit your features." And I blushed. While I was waiting for Eisenhower, I made sure to make myself comfortable. I wanted to show Cole that I had grown. I missed him so much, and I wanted to know every single detail. "Why didn't you call?" were the very first words that Matthias said ever since he had come. I was dumbstruck and found out that I didn't have any reasonable answer. I had been drawn into my victory that I had forgotten about everything else. It all felt like a dream that I had been in the human realm, a dream that I didn't want to remember. It had been hard for me, going through the task of caring for my mother, working at the pub to fend for the both of us along with Shadow, and the boring history and science that made me tired after a long day at school. "Matt," I started, but suddenly I didn't know what to say. I didn't know whether to convince him or admit to the fact that I decided not to call. I felt very bad that the way he looked at me was now different. It wasn't with disdain or anger. It was with the love of a child. Tears swelled up in my eyes when I looked at him, and he looked surprised, like he had said something bad. "Did I do something?" he asked innocently, and I cleaned the tears off of my face. I sure had been doing a lot of crying these days. I missed Cole and Matt so much, but the happiness I had clouded my decisions. Even though the joy had been short-lived, it felt really good. But now I knew how much time I had spent away from the first people that gave me hope that everything would be fine. Seeing them again gave me a ray of hope that the future would stand. I was ready to take the huge leap of faith. But first, I needed to know how they got past Draenen's defenses. "How did you know where I was?" I asked Cole, and he smiled darkly. I scrunched up my eyebrows, waiting for an answer, and the two brothers gave each other a knowing look. "Show her, Matt," Cole said, and I looked at both of them in amusement. Something was definitely up. "Wind magic! Hand of Boreas!" he chanted, and I felt the temperature drop a few degrees. The wind inside the house had picked up, even though most of the windows were closed. The glass chandelier clinked and rattled as it rotated before coming to an abrupt stop. It looked like everywhere had been hit by a flash freeze. The windows had frosted over, and snowflakes fell from nowhere. A little snow had piled up in one corner, and I could see my breath as I exhaled. My hands felt like they would fall off because of the freezing cold. It felt like I had suddenly been thrust to the North Pole. I expected to see penguins instantly, but I swatted the thoughts away and examined the precision of the magic. It was something I'd never seen. I had never known someone who could perform magic at this scale, and to think it was wind magic. I knew that wind users were like the most powerful of witches, but I had never seen one in action. They were famed to be the best searchers, and their spells were known to cover a wide range. But this child in front of me was barely 11. And to think that he and his brother had crossed the powerful wards that protected Draenen from the wandering humans. He had not only controlled the air, but he also made it colder. Cold enough to create snowflakes and snowballs, and he had said his spells in English, which was the weakest way of performing magic spells. Spells needed a deep connection to enable them to bring out the most effect. The only connection they had was the ancestral language of Hecate, and that was why we used Latin for our spells. It reinforced the magic behind them, which made each one stronger than usual. "I hope I won't get frostbite," I said, and Matt laughed. It was a small, airy one, like the way Cole laughed when we were together. It made my heart swell, and I almost cried. Just a few months ago, he had been missing, and Cole had almost gone crazy. His determination fueled mine, and we went to the extreme to get him back. Now he was of age, and a good mageling. His control over the wind element told me that much. "Recede by the finger of the south," he said, and I felt my whole body tremble. I had never felt such powerful magic before, and it felt like I had been hit by a truck. My whole body felt sore, and I immediately knew that Matt was going to be a great witch someday. The power behind those words was even stronger than most Latin spells. Maybe it was due to the nature of their birth, but I knew that Matt was special. And I was glad that those evil people had not gotten their dirty hands on him and broken his spirit. Seeing him smile in front of me was a big relief. The snow had melted to nothingness, and a blast of hot air blew my frosty clothes dry. It felt like I was thrust from the North Pole in the opposite direction. The heat became sweltering, but after a few moments turned humid and a little colder, just the way Drainan was. The way the rains alternated with heat made the best climate possible. The wards didn't identify Matt as a threat, and since he shrouded me with his magic, we entered pretty easily. "But Matt, how did you learn those spells?" I asked, looking at my feet. I was trying my best not to reach out and hug him. "I did a little digging into Uncle Demented journals and found a few. I just kept practicing until I got it right. Although they all sound awkward when I say them." "If they were Latin, they'd have been way cooler," he said innocently, and I couldn't stop myself from smiling. "I can get you a few new spells," I said, just as Eisenhower brought the juice and a few styrofoam cups. "If you're all done with your witchy hullabaloo, why didn't you visit?" Cole asked questioningly, and I reflexively looked at my feet. "Cole," I wanted to defend myself, but he was way faster than me. "If we didn't know something was up, you would have rushed into it head on and gotten a few scrapes," he said jokingly. "You know you can always tell us when you need our help. Asking for help is not a bad thing at all," Matt put in. "But how did you know about anything?" I threw the question at Cole, but he just gestured to Matt, who was savoring the taste of Drainan's special oranges that only came once a year. It was way better than those in the human realm and had a lot of juice. Since it was native to Drainan, it helped to boost magic reserves, amongst a few others. "We're linked in some kind of way. I don't really understand it, but some things have been invading my mind. I've been seeing a vision of red skies and gray sand stretching forever. Hungry people, moving slowly in ripped clothes and half-burnt shoes. They looked like the whole world was on their bony shoulders," Matt said, and I blanched. It was like every muscle in my body stiffened at the same time. I had no idea that someone was looking in my dreams, that Matt and I shared an inexplicable bond. It was something I'd never heard of. "Rosalind, I know it's weird, but it seems like when you saved me, something happened. I have been able to feel what you were feeling. The joy and happiness were also what I felt. But when you became troubled, I knew I had to help. Cole also had no objections. In fact, he was the one that dragged me across town," Matt replied and laughed at Cole's red face. The way the two brothers acted was so beautiful that it made me think of everything I had lost over the years. I was all alone and left to fend for myself. "What's really happening?" Cole asked. "It's nothing I can't handle," I replied as quickly as I could without hesitation. "You know you can trust me. You don't have to fight all your battles alone," he replied, and placed his hand over mine. Then the tears spilled over, and Cole pulled me into his embrace. His scent invaded my mind, and it brought me comfort. For the first time in a long time, I finally felt safe, even though none of my parents were there. He planted a small kiss on my lips and smiled when my face reddened. "Care to show us around and tell us what's going on?" Cole said after he downed his cup of orange juice and smacked his lips. It was good to have some fresh faces around here. At least, it made me seem less scared. And that was when I remembered Shadow. "Let's go meet my cat," I said, and led the way to the room. Matt peppered me with questions as we walked up the stone stairs. I answered question after question until I got tired and Cole shushed him. The door to my room was left slightly open, and I saw that the room had been cleaned. Probably by Mitchell or Dorothy, one of the other witches that helped us around the house. "Why does he look like that?" Matt asked, and I sighed before launching into a carefully detailed explanation of everything that had happened in the last 3 days. The grotesque death of Amelia Maylie, and the false accusation of my mother, Shadow's poisoning and the search for a cure, the location we found from the small scribbled numbers found at the site of her death. My story was met with a lot of oohs and ahs, but I kept talking. Finally, I told them about the visions I had been having about the destruction of Drainan by something that was shrouded in so much magic that I couldn't even begin to comprehend. Then I added my father's warning and my next course of action. When I was through, both of them had their mouths hanging open. "And you didn't bother to tell us?" Cole asked, angry with worry streaked on his face. "How have you been holding up?" he asked, the anger and worry immediately draining from his face. The only thing that was left was some kind of hope and the fierce determination that he would do anything to set things straight. A strange feeling engulfed my stomach, and I felt my heart flutter. So this was love. I wanted the feeling to last forever, but it was fleeting, like the soft caress of the wind as it struck the wind chimes in the Aegean tower. Shadow had woken up from his sleep, and his heartbeat had become erratic, so loud that I could almost hear it when I strained my ears. His fur had become a darker shade of blue, and the life from his eyes was fading minute by minute. "Isn't there something to stop the poison?" Matt asked, and I shook my head. I had gone through every book on herb studies in the Laurent Library. The symptoms that Shadow had weren't even listed, even in the forbidden poison section. I was just groping around in the dark with no idea what was happening. "I've checked everywhere, but there's nothing on the symptoms," I said back, and went to take a look at my best friend. To think that I would lose him in this way was saddening. I never expected that Shadow would have any cause to leave me to die at the hand of a lunatic who was hellbent on destroying my family. "But what if it's not poison?" Matt said, and I wondered what he was talking about. Aunt Jessie had used her magic to probe every inch of his body, so there was no way I wasn't sure. "It is. It's a matter of, will I be able to save him? But what happens is that the poison slows down for a while I send a lot of my magic in. It's like it feeds on magic steadily," I muttered, but loud enough for Cole to catch it. "How can we help?" Cole asked solemnly after he had gotten a debrief of the situation. "Take me to the library. Maybe there's a way I can help," Matt said, and I took him by the hand. Cole carried Shadow bridal style, and we all went to the library. The windows were open, and I felt relieved with the blast of fresh air. Sunlight streamed through the windows, and dust motes swirled in the air, swaying to the rhythm of the wind. But as we got in, Matt muttered a few words, and the temperature dropped again. But it did not feel chilly like before. It was like a gentle cold breeze that picked up a bit before turning into an arm that extended forth and picked up a book before dissolving. I should have gotten used to the fact that Matt was a mageling, but I was still as surprised as ever. I had learned that magelings had almost thrice the magic reserves of normal witches. They were powerful beings, and a wind user at that would be coveted in Drainan. The book opened midair and floated gently despite being heavy, and landed on Matt's open palms. It had opened to a particular page that was filled with drawings and charts. He pored over it while I tried building magic in my stomach. Even if I ran out of magic, I would use anything in my power to slow down the flow of the poison. Cole cooed to Shadow, who just rolled his eyes and closed them quickly. Ventus Ziploc, caress de notos, he whispered, and I felt the room rumble. The temperature climbed several degrees. It became infuriatingly hot. That Cole's face had reddened and his shirt had become plastered to his body. I could see the thread of magic in the air, weaving itself into a very complex form. His magic had become visible. It was unlike anything I had ever seen. It was a beautiful gold, overlapped with red and green that wove around him. It thickened for a moment before spreading out into the room. Shadow coughed up a hairball, and the blue color paled drastically. He didn't go back to normal, but his breathing was no longer labored. He almost looked fine, and I gave him a smile so big that it could engulf him. He just rolled his eyes, and his voice rang in my head. "This boy sure is strong," he said. I felt the poison recede. I don't even know which power he uses, but it feels like he can use the power of the Animoi of old. Animoi? I asked him, but he just told me that he would talk to me later because his life was top priority, and I laughed. I had missed him so much. I have only bought a few hours at most. We need to find the antidote as soon as possible, Matt said. How are you going to find it? I asked, my heart beating rapidly for no reason. Don't worry. Get on with freeing your mother. Let us handle this, Cole said. And they disappeared into the wind, leaving me to myself. I picked up my father's grimoire, and as I opened it, a small Ziploc bag fell from it. I had never seen it in all my years of sifting through the large tome. In it were 3 small seeds that looked wrinkled. I tried to think about what plant it was, but my thoughts were disturbed by Aunt Jessie. I just put the small bag into my pocket and followed her, with renewed determination to find whoever was trying to destroy my family. Chapter 6. The fields were just like I read. Ash and soot covered the ground, and nothing grew on the surface. It was reminiscent of the parched ground that I had seen in the terrible visions I had been having lately. Even the air was ominous and smelled like wet, rotting wood. I never knew a place this dead could be in Drainan. All my life, I had always thought that my home country was the best amongst all, where the birds called out to one another, notes overlapping to form a beautiful symphony. A place where the grass was evergreen, its color bringing life to the beautiful environment. The place where the sun was forever warm on our skin, the buttery yellow stone in the clouds bringing life and happiness. Cool mornings with dew on the surface of leaves and cobwebs, with ants aching to drink the clear, sparkling water. But this was the perfect opposite of everything I had come to know. It was stark and cold, with the wind biting at my bare shoulders. I shivered and pulled myself together, using my magic to keep me warm. Now I knew why Aunt Jessie had told me to dress in the official Laurent robes. Red wool with the phoenix crest of House Laurent emblazoned on it. It was very heavy to wear, but somehow my aunt still carried herself majestically, as if she were walking on air. I desperately wanted to know how Cole and Matt were doing. I was very happy because I knew Shadow was in safe hands, but another part of me knew that trespassing in Drainan had serious consequences. We shuffled forward, my feet almost sinking inside the wet ground. My aunt was on high alert, her head scanning the whole place for threats. The tension was so thick that it could be cut with a knife. "What made this place like this?" I asked my aunt. Surely, I knew that from the stories, Drainan was created to prosper. Hecate made sure that it was made to house powerful witches that would stay in Drainan. Everyone had a role to play and lent magic to the earth on a daily basis. Even though it was a minuscule amount that was taken when a person awoke, it was sufficient enough to make everywhere full of life. It was self-reviving and wonderful, a place I had grown to love with all my heart. "It's the blood of the infernals. Surely you must have heard the folk tales of old," she replied as she passed beside another anthill, the 5th one I had seen since I got here. It made every inch of my skin crawl, and I wanted to scream, but I knew that I couldn't. A clue was in there that would help me to find my mother, and I would do anything to get there. "Didn't your mother tell you the stories?" she asked when I shook my head. It was pretty much obvious now that I really knew nothing about Drainan's history, one of the things that was taught in the local school. My issue was one of the disadvantages of homeschooling. It was sad that I didn't get to talk and mingle with other children of my age. I had missed my perfect opportunity to gain the social skills needed for life, and that was why I still didn't fit in with the society. Even though I wanted to be like everyone so badly, I figured that my parents had a reason for me to become socially awkward. But now, even though I tried to think up all the excuses they could have had, it all felt very stupid. Long ago, right here in these fields, there had been an invasion right here. It had been hordes from the underworld, called the Draconians, that set their feet right here. It had been a bad war, with Hecate, our matron, coming down to save us. A lot of blood was shed right here, and a lot had been the blood of witches. It was a terrible day that we never hope to see again, she explained as we moved through the gray fields. "Who are the Draconians? They sound like a really terrible dance troupe," I said, and she laughed. "Something you picked up from your time in the human realm?" she asked in that sweet voice that made me smile. "Yes," I whispered, blushing, and she just ruffled my hair. I wished I had grown up in the Laurent house surrounded by the love of the family. I wondered why my mother moved with my father to the outskirts of Drainan, far away from the people. It was a good life at first, but I wanted to explore. I wanted to see the huge cities, Imberhold, Sanctum, Visorum, but I never had the chance to mix with other people. It was more like I was hidden away from the world. The Draconians were a race from the hordes of hell. They are well illustrated in the Laurent's bestiary. Wherever they went, they brought darkness and plague. Half serpent, half human, with the powers to end all life. They were the worst of the worst, she explained, and stopped as we reached the mouth of a cave. I brought out my witchstone and sent my magic into it. It blazed up like an inferno, burning brightly and letting a greenish-white light spill from it. Shadows danced around the walls, making the air more ominous. The rocks were a parched gray, just like the ground, drained of all the color it had. A lone dead tree creaked in the distance and almost made me jump. "This must be it," Aunt Jessie said and walked in, and I followed her, unsure of what we were going to face. Everything felt so wrong, like I was violating a sacred place. My skin crawled, and I tried to keep myself from jumping at any little sound. We reached a large stone door, and Aunt Jessie pushed it open. The door hissed open, feeling like 1,000 snakes were singing. A dais was at the far side of the room, illuminated by a strange silver light that looked like moonlight. Surely it had to be somewhere around midday, and I wondered where the light was coming from. On the west side were stone statues that looked like soldiers of the Alabaster Corps. They had stone swords by their sides, and they looked rather intimidating because they were over 6 feet tall. Aunt Jessie moved forward towards the dais, and from nowhere, lightning struck. With my quick reflexes, I had grown vines over her head from nowhere. I just felt my magic respond. I could feel the whole room thrumming with magic. It felt like an amplifier, boosting the magic I had tenfold. My body jerked forward, batting away strike after strike. Flames roared and water raged, and my magic countered each strike. This place was surely booby-trapped, so Amelia must have been hiding something really valuable here. It was like something was waiting for me at the dais, something that would exonerate my mother from her predicament at the Carftaline Manor. To think that I would finally see her again after so long gave me the strength to push forward. Aunt Jessie used her fire, pushing forward also. Her flames warmed us up and kept the ragged teeth of the cold away. As we got closer to the dais, the wind picked up, and it was strong enough to lift stones from the ground. Little rocks were swung at us, and my reflexes were a little slower. I got a few cuts on my hands and face, but I reacted immediately after that and covered us in a shroud of vine so thick that I was sure it would give a swordman some issues. The wind blew for a while, raging like a lion before calming down. I was afraid of whatever Amelia was hiding. Whatever it was worth hiding behind a lot of traps that would probably kill an average witch. I didn't know why the room boosted my magic, but I had never felt this powerful in a long time. It was the same feeling I had when I helped rescue Matt. I felt invincible and powerful, certain that I could bring down anything that came my way. I didn't bother to think of my vines growing in this dead soil, but at least I was glad that I could shield myself and my aunt from everything we had seen here. Amelia had gone to great lengths to hide whatever it was in here. We were finally in front of the dais when the stone statues moved. I inched back in terror, but Aunt Jessie had gone forward, dodging strike after strike and parrying with a blade of fire that she had formed in her hand. It was so thin and emanated so much magic that my body shivered involuntarily. It cut through the stone sword like a hot knife on butter. She fought as my mother would. A silent dance, moving like water, albeit wielding fire. It was eerily beautiful, and the stone statues crumbled to the ground. She pulled me up with a smile, and we both got on the dais. There were intricate patterns and designs on the stone, carvings that looked like one weird story. There was a large papyrus paper on the dais, illuminated by the weird light I had seen earlier. I picked up the paper, and it felt like it was going to crumble because it was ages old. I quickly read the contents, seeing measurements and ingredients for a potion of some sort. Some of the ingredients couldn't even be found because they no longer existed. As I read the third line, the paper burst into flames. I read the contents quickly as the paper burned. "Throw it away!" Aunt Jessie screeched. I threw the paper, and it exploded, casting a bright light and scorch marks on the wall. My mind flipped over, and I felt all my magic drain out of me. Aunt Jessie still stood tall, but sadness covered her face. She also wanted to save my mother from the claws of the Carftaline Manor. That place could drive anyone crazy, and she was there for something she knew nothing about. I still wondered how a recipe could save my mother, but I was glad that we had gotten here before whoever poisoned Shadow did. We were finally one step ahead, but my father's warning still rang in my head. I closed my eyes and cried. Chapter 7. I was back at the place I had called the House of Horrors. A lone soldier of the Alabaster Corps stood at the entrance like a knight in shining armor. The late setting sun made him look ethereal as he stood guard over the prison that held my mother. My head was swamped with so many thoughts as I moved through the house with Aunt Jessie. I was no longer scared of the horrors that were hidden in the dark crevices, but I was of the impending doom that was going to befall the Laurent family. The fiery princess could not be killed. Otherwise, the Laurent family would lose their honor in the witches' society. They would no longer be held in high esteem, and the image they had built during the Cold War would crumble to dust. I knew that even though my grandparents felt like their hands were tied by the war, Aunt Jessie would not be. From the stories I had heard from my mother, she was wild and carefree, flouting laws like nobody's business and getting punished or saved by my mother. With Aunt Jessie beside me, I was filled with determination and vigor. My magic had returned, and I cast a simple spell. Plant comissi nascentia ex lumine, subsidium nobis viam invenire, I whispered, and I heard my voice echo, as if spoken through 1,000 mouths. This was what the Carftaline Manor did, distorting our senses and making us succumb to its wiles. A lone plant grew from the palm of my hand, the young sapling blooming faster than I could have imagined. 5 petals opened from the bud, and pollen spilled from the flower. The petals were a bright golden color, and they drifted from the flower, lighting a path. "You have really good magic, you know," Aunt Jessie said, and for once, I was thankful for the darkness because I didn't want her to see how red my face was. She would have probably teased me into next year. Now, I had a hope of next year because of what we found in Ashkelon. It was a breakthrough that we had gotten there faster. I was going to assure my mother that everything was going to be okay. Little steps at a time, and we would finally get there. The time when she would finally be free. Free to dance again like she always did, being one with her element. The pollen drifted up a flight of stairs, and we followed it down several corridors that were ever-changing before we finally reached my mother. To my utmost surprise, she looked healthier than I would have thought, even though her skin was a little gray. I hugged her tightly as if I would never see her again. Truth be told, I really wanted her to be home so that she could comfort me when I needed it, and also talk about the boys. Aunt Jessie's eyes glazed over, and I immediately knew she was having a neural link. When she was through, she hugged my mom so tightly I thought her bones would break. "I'm sorry, I have to go. I've been summoned at the House of Miud," she said, and took her leave with her slippers clanking loudly on the linoleum. The flowers I had grown when I last saw her were still fresh and blossoming. I knew that my mother was really doing everything she could to keep them alive. My magic had faded from them, and I knew that she must have been using her magic in a way to keep them alive. "I've missed you, Rosalind," she said, and hugged me. I sank into her embrace and held on tight as though I would never let go. "How have you been growing the flowers?" I asked her, and she just smiled. I knew that there was no way a fire element could nurture the flowers. Instead, It would make them shrivel up from the inside. Changing my magic attribute, of course, she said matter-of-factly. How'd you do that? I asked her, not sure if I could be blamed for my naivety. She made flames dance across her palm, brightly burning from a moment before I saw a white light. In those few seconds, I was stunned temporarily, and when I opened my eyes, water was on her hands in place of flames, and she just dribbled it on the petals. I looked at her in awe, and she smiled at me sweetly, just like Aunt Jessie would. Is that even supposed to be possible? I asked, and she just shook her head. I'll tell you everything when I get out of here, she said, and smiled. It was strange to see her smile in chains, but she was so sure that she would get out of the Carftaline Manor. She had so much trust in me, and I couldn't afford to take the wrong step. I had to do everything in my power to get her out of there. Why wasn't I ever taught anything? Why wasn't I allowed to go to school like the rest of the kids? I suddenly asked, and my mother's smile was wiped off of her face immediately, even though she didn't answer my question. I went to the fields of Ashkelon today, Mom. I don't even know the history of Draenor or when or what Draconians are, I said, not angrily, but rather sad. I wanted to know everything. At the mention of Ashkelon, my mom looked at me, frantic and filled with despair. What's wrong? Why were you in Ashkelon? She replied, her voice suddenly cold. I shuddered and whispered. I went to find a way to get you out of here, I started, launching into a story of everything I had faced. I didn't mention Shadow's poisoning or Cole's arrival because I didn't want her to worry for nothing. It felt unfair for her to even be here in the first place. I want you to trust no one, she said, almost exactly the same way I had heard my father say it before his voice became lost in the wind. What are you talking about? I asked, quite unsure of why my mother would say the same thing that my father had said, even though I left that part out because I didn't want her to remember his death. I wanted her to be strong and not lose hope. I remember when Jessica and I used to roam the Scarlet Meadow, dancing in the rain. She was only second to me in firepower. She was talented, and I can even say more graceful than I was when it came to the dance of the flames. But it was never enough for her. She learned some magic that was deemed forbidden, and she was almost killed if not for the start of the Cold War. She had already proved herself valuable to Draenor, and that was why she was pardoned. What are you trying to say, Mom? The thing is, some people might look all sweet on the outside, but are different on the inside. I know Jessie couldn't have been the one behind this. She would never kill since she could never withstand blood. But all I'm saying is that people are not who you think they are, she finished, and pulled me in closer for another hug. This time, she hugged me tighter and whispered in my ear. The court has shifted the execution forward because of the Maylies family. It's in 2 days, my beautiful Rose, she said, and tears ran down her face. My mom was afraid to die, and seeing her made me realize how fragile we were, even if we were witches. Even humans had much more emotional strength than we did. We felt everything differently and much more powerfully than the grief in my heart was almost unable to bear. I had never felt so sad in my entire life. The tears flowed freely, and my heart was heavy. But my determination was already etched in stone. I would find whoever did this and bring them to justice. With Cole and the Mayling, Matt, beside me, I knew that I was sure to win. But I wasn't going to let this play out any longer. Something needed to be done very fast. I want you to trust Jessie. She's the only person powerful enough to help me out of this, she said as she pulled away. Okay, Mom, I said, and stood up to leave. Time was ticking faster than ever now, and I had to be strong for the both of us. I found my way past the maze of corridors and out the manor. I was so angry that my mother was going to do nothing about it. It was like leading a lamb to the slaughter. I knew my mother didn't kill Amelia, but it was infuriating to see her do nothing about it, like she had accepted the fate that had befallen her. But deep down, I knew I couldn't let that happen. I wouldn't lose anyone I loved. Never again. 8. I had run up the stairs in trepidation and anger, bounding over 3 at a time. For this to work out, I needed knowledge about Drainan. Knowledge that the person I was trying to bring to justice knew nothing about. I was hoping I could find a weak spot in the defenses, but I found out that I literally knew nothing about who I was facing. All I knew was that the person had killed someone, damaging the body and leaving without a trace. Surely, it had to have been physical. Maybe a knife or something. And now, I knew there was an ability to change magic attributes. It could have been anybody with sufficient knowledge of magic. I went through a list of possible names, trying to look for ex-convicts who were still living in the society. A number of names popped up, and I tried looking them up, but nothing came out of it. I then proceeded to look for the houses that could have had a fight with the Maylies over the years. The Maylies had been artifact keepers, and that definitely attracted a lot of bad people. This was due to the fact that artifacts were usually vessels of power, and in the case of the relics given by Hecate herself, there was no end to the list of bad people that could be coming after them. For one, I knew that they held relics that could give power beyond the extraordinary. These relics were hidden in safe positions all over Drainan. Maybe someone had tried to coax the location out of Amelia. That narrowed it down to the main houses: Mewd, Niberius, Nyrog, Raven, and Laurent. I took my mind off of Laurent immediately because I knew that we all trusted one another, and that was key. I knew that no one would ever kill for power. House Niberius was known for its pride and rules. They never had blood on their hands because they used people to do their dirty work. Even in the Cold War, they were strategists, putting plans in place to make sure Drainan won. I ruled out their name with charcoal and concentrated on those remaining. The Mewds consisted of a bloodline of earth users who wanted peace. They were never warriors, but scouts, and never took part in warfare. They worshipped Hecate with everything they had and were blessed with so much magic reserves in their bloodline. There was no way the Mewd would have wanted to kill a young woman for one of the relics. It went against their motto, which was Omnis Potentia Hecate, which meant that all power belonged to Hecate. They would do no such thing. I scrawled a line over their name and went to the next one. The Nyrogs were wild and free. They were like little sprites, mischievous but adorable. They were mostly nature lovers who had a knack for mischief. None of them had the heart to kill a human. They were mostly kind despite their wiles. Under that mischievous look and a personality was a down-to-earth person who couldn't hurt a fly. I canceled their name and finally focused on the last one. House Raven was the house with the most convicts. They dabbled in poison and forbidden magic and were almost exiled if not for their immovable stand against the whole of Drainan. They were the upholders of the economy and were one of the wealthiest houses in the whole country. They held so much power and always wanted more. My mind went back to the vision I had of the red skies and the starved people. The skies were red like blood. It must have been a hint that I had been neglecting. I just needed to find who the culprit was. I had already narrowed it down a few notches, and I knew I was getting closer. "Rosalind!" I heard Aunt Jessie call, and I stood up, preparing to pack up my notes. It was way into the evening and already tea time, which was compulsory for everyone in the Laurent family. The Ziploc bag I had picked up earlier slipped from my pocket, and I picked it up. I still had no idea which plants they were. I made a mental note to find out and put them back in my pocket. They might come in handy. I opened the door and heard that familiar, rich, arrogant voice in my head. "Look who's home," he said, and I screamed for joy. Happiness exploded in my chest, and I hugged him so tight after taking him from Cole. His fur was back to normal, and I had never been so happy to see my arrogant cat, hale and hearty. "I missed you too," I replied back, but he just looked away nonchalantly, even though I knew he missed me too. I had so many questions to ask him, particularly how he felt when he was on the brink of death. We both went down the stairs, with me peppering a very tired Matt and Cole with questions. When I got down, I excused myself and dragged them out into the garden. "So what happened? Have you found who did it?" I asked, wanting a full explanation. "Well, yes and no. We found the house after a long search with Matt almost exhausting his magic reserves. Damn, the lady has 10 more cats inside her house. How does she do that?" Cole said, and I laughed. I liked the way he looked at me, like I was special and meant to be treated with utmost care. It was a lot of work and stories, but we finally got Shadow healed. Cora had lost her familiar, who was also a cat in a tragic fire in Sanctum. She had taken in a lot of cats, but it didn't seem to heal the space that her familiar's death had caused. So she wanted to have Shadow by all means and gave him a potion that she collected from a Raven house member, which was supposed to turn Shadow's heart to her, but she found out it was poison after feeding it to one of the cats, explained Matt with a few gestures here and there as he spoke. "So it was the Raven house after all," I whispered under my breath. She had already prepared an antidote and apologized so much that I wanted to cry, Matt finally finished, and knew that they were just making it not sound too good. I imagined the amount of work that they must have put in to save him. I was beginning to love humans even over my own kind. They weren't as frivolous and bad as they were labeled to be. I smiled and pulled Matt closer. He blushed furiously when I hugged him, and I just smiled back. "Thank you for everything." "What happened while we were gone?" asked Cole. I finally knew who was behind my mother's problems, and now all I needed was evidence that it was the Raven house that was behind Amelia's horrible death. I explained everything that had happened in Ashkelon, including the fact that I had a probably high-grade recipe to make something that I didn't even know about. I didn't even know how I could remember it, but somehow the ingredients burned themselves into my memory. I also told them about my suspicions about my aunt ever since my mom told me about her mischief when she was little. Matt floated a piece of paper and a charcoal stub down from the top window, which I guessed was the library. He gave them to me, and I wrote down the list of ingredients that I had seen, and it was indeed a weird mix. 1 pound of copper, 5 petals of the white sunflower, which was only native to Visorum, 5 ounces of mercury, the heart of a newt, and some other things I had never heard of in my life. Matt pored over the paper, his eyebrows scrunched in concentration. I was sure that Cole must be proud of his brother. It surely had taken a lot to save him, but I had known that he was really worth the risk. "I know this," he said suddenly, and his eyes lit up with excitement. I was taken aback and couldn't believe my ears. There was no way he knew it. There was nothing about the recipe in the tomes I had read. It was in Uncle Dweeb's notebook, just like the spells I had learned. "What's it for?" Cole asked, cuddling Shadow, who had jumped away from my arms. "It's called the Potion of Ascension. It's a potion to prepare one's body, soul, and mind for the habitation of power so vast that it can do all things, even change the flow of time. takes the person to a higher plane that transcends all," he said, talking so fast that I could barely hear the words he was saying. I finally put two and two together. I pictured the scene in my head of Amelia running away from her killer, looking frantically for someone to come to her aid. Her pursuer had a knife, long and freshly polished, in his right hand. He asked her for the potion when he cornered her, but she refused, and he proceeded to torture her. When he could get nothing, he killed her. But before he could, he used her large magic to show the coordinates that were covered in her blood. The person wanted the potion so that his body could be able to contain the power the Ring of Minos held. This was why the person also wanted Shadow out of the equation. He knew that Shadow was going to help me find whatever it was that separated my mother from me. "I'm going back in," Matt said, and took Shadow from Cole. The temperature had dropped for the first time in weeks, and it was good for a start. "You know you're beautiful, right?" he said awkwardly, and I just laughed. This was one of the reasons why I loved him. I took his hand, and we walked together in the garden for some time before finally sitting on the stone chair in the center. The moon had come out of hiding from beyond the clouds and bathed us in its silvery light. We looked at each other briefly, and without speaking, we already knew what the other wanted to do. Cole's lips crashed into mine, and I savored every minute I had with him, knowing that he loved me just like I loved him. Chapter 9. I had barely slept through the night. I kept turning listlessly, thinking about what I had with Cole, and for one fleeting moment, I was happy that I had finally gotten another step closer to finding who it was that separated me from my mother. Today was the last day I had before my mother was executed publicly at the gallows, and her soul would be lost because she would not be consecrated. I couldn't imagine that type of scenario where I would see my mother's cold body in my arms. I had been up early, partly because I had been roaming through the room, barely able to sleep. Shadow had slept throughout the night, and I made sure not to disturb him. I closed my eyes again and took a deep breath of the musty library's air. The smell of old paper seemed to be the only thing that had calmed me these past few days, and I was grateful to find something I liked doing, apart from the occasional search for the killer issues. Matt had gone out with Shadow to get the ingredients for the potion from the Haven. I was so sure that since we got there before whoever was looking for it laid his filthy hands on it, he would come for us sooner or later. I knew that it was only a matter of time before a killer came knocking at my doorstep. I also wanted to use the potion as bait, and I wanted to watch him gobble it all up. Hook, line, and sinker. Matt and Shadow had not yet returned, and I was trying to find the location of the relics with Cole. I had used the same numbers in several possible combinations, but nothing seemed to work. Nothing came out of the map, and after a lot of tries, I sighed and wished my father was here. The only reminder of him that I had was his grimoire and a Ziploc bag with 3 seeds of a plant I didn't know. The door jerked open, and I saw Matt panting as if he had run a marathon. "What's wrong?" I asked, noticing the sheen of sweat that had covered his face. Someone took the ingredients," he managed to say. This was something else. The person already had the one thing we had as bait, the one thing we could use to free our mother. But it looked like there was a silver lining here. I was so sure that no one in Drayton knew about the potion of ascension. From what I had seen in the old texts, the Maylies mandated each person who was the legal person from each house to swear an oath of secrecy. Neither the potion recipe nor preparation was shared, and I knew that the person who stole it probably knew we were getting closer to finding the truth. We couldn't stop now. "What did the person look like?" Cole asked, and I could see he was itching for a fight. It was adorable, but here in Drayton, a human fighting with a witch would die before he could lift a finger. black hair with equally piercing black eyes. She had a large crest on her cloak, which looked somewhat familiar. A raven on top of a pearly white skull. She was so creepy, Matt said, and for the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. That was when I realized all this time, Matt was still a child. Despite the fact that he had powers, his mind was still very fragile. This person was already trying to derail us, and I wouldn't let that happen. And that was when it clicked. Surely, the Maylies would have used the name of their only daughter as a code. There was only one way I could use it. I wrote her name down with Cole, and using the numbers I had found earlier, I overlaid them on top of one another, and it was all right before me. The Mellark Rock. That was where the relics were. Quickly, Cole, Matt, and I ran to the haven to get the ingredients while Shadow hitched a ride with Cole. He claimed that Cole was more stable than I was, and I was thankful that they were bonding. After a little haggle and some weird looks, we got the ingredients and started preparing them in the library. According to Matt, I melted all the solids into one dark sludge before pouring in the liquids while Cole stirred evenly. The last ingredient was the white sunflower petals, which had been very easy to find because they grew almost everywhere in Drainan. As Cole stirred the petals in, the sludge immediately watered down to a tonic-like consistency and, from black, became a bright gold color. We simmered it a little before pouring it into a glass jar and set out for the Mellark Rock, which was at the outskirts of Drainan. Matt made us one with the wind, and we floated, sailing fast towards our destination. Finally, it was all going to be over soon. I would finally see my mother again, free. I couldn't wait for Aunt Jessie because she wasn't around. And I had hoped that the description Matt gave would fit her in, but now I trusted her completely. I just wanted to be sure that there were no enemies on the inside that I didn't know about. Things were about to get a whole lot messier. Mellark Rock was the place where most people knew about, but didn't go there. It was due to the rumors that were spread about the dangers that lurked in every corner, waiting to devour your magic. It was a place of nightmares and tales for young children. That was why it was the perfect place for hiding items that held vast powers that were comparable to that of Hecate. I felt the soft breeze leave my skin, followed by intense heat that threatened to ravage my skin and tear me into pieces. Flies buzzed in the air, and the humid air clung to me. Mellark Rock stood before us, intimidating and tall. I whispered a silent prayer and looked back at my companions. Cole looked scared out of his mind, and Matt just looked ahead, stoic for a child. I smiled at them, wondering how fate had blessed me with good people. Together, we walked into the unknown. There were no barriers as we walked into the cave with my witchstone in Matt's hands. There were scorched marks on the walls and a lot of dried thorns laid aside. There must be someone here already. We proceeded with caution, staying close to the walls. As we ventured deeper, we smelled something acrid. Blood was spilled across the walls, and that confirmed my guess. Blood magic! Far off was a person cloaked in the red robes of the Raven House. The witchstone shone with blue light across the cavern, sending spidery shadows on the walls, dancing as we moved forward. The person looked back for a split second, and I felt the hatred and bloodlust all the way from where she was. The same black hair and eyes that looked like Cole, just like Matt had described. But through all my checks of the members of the Raven House, I had never seen that face. I hid and extinguished the witchstone, and she took her sights away from us. I let out a breath I didn't even realize I was holding. We moved forward, groping around in the dark. There was a light at the end of the cavern, although not really illuminating. I told Cole and Matt to wait behind, while Shadow and I went forward to find the person who was behind all my woes. I slinked in the dark just like Shadow had taught me without making a sound. I almost tripped a lot of times, but I still tried not to make a sound. Clinging to the walls was a lot of problems, and trying not to trip made me go on all fours. The rocks scraped my knees and feet, but I was determined not to make a sound. I was close to victory and couldn't afford to fail now. I was about to reach a dais when a bright light flared. A red light enveloped the whole cavern, and it was so bright that my eyes watered. I shielded my eyes until the light dimmed considerably, but it was still bright enough to fill the whole cavern with a light that was almost like the sun, covering everything in a red glow. I watched the robes burn with fire in bands of blues, purples, and greens. I searched for a ring, but I could see none. I had imagined a signet ring dripping with blood, but instead I saw a crown of plumage dazzling in gold and red and yellow. I saw the skin burn off the face, and I saw the familiar accentuated cheekbones, those thin lips that smiled at me more than 1,000 times, the golden green eyes like a cat staring at me in pain. Veins popped around her neck, and her hair flowed out from behind her like a wall of fire. It was Aunt Jessie! I screamed from the tightening and pain in my chest. It was her all along. She poisoned Shadow and deceived us all, using my mother to get closer to her goal. I was brimming with so much fear that my magic exploded beyond my control. I had never released so much magic at once. Glass crawled over my body, but this time I felt it was stronger. It had a greenish tint to it that shone even with the reddish glow that enveloped the room. Cole was behind me with his hands on my shoulder, but I didn't have any feeling of that. Everything that was oozing out of me was hatred, anger, and magic. My skin was beginning to burn up, and my head was aching. Vines shot out of the ground at a blinding speed, but before it could get close, it incinerated, turning to dust. They shot out again, this time thicker, but they couldn't withstand the heat. I was fighting against my natural enemy. All this time, I had avoided people with fire element because they were amongst the strongest witches ever. Hecate wielded fire most of the time, her torches burning forever. I knew that I didn't stand a chance, but the fury kept me going, and I felt my pocket heat up. The seeds! They were responding to the sheer amount of magic that I kept releasing. I had always thought that they were of no use because of their wrinkled, dried state. But what happened was beyond me. It was incomprehensible. The seeds sprouted into little saplings as they fell to the ground, growing alarmingly fast because of the intricate magic that was in the air. They fed on the magic, eating it up and growing until they became 3 beings that I had seen once in the bestiary. They were bipedal humanoid figures, but their skin had a greenish tint to it. I knew that they were women from the long flowing hair made of vines, twigs, and flowers. Their bodies hardened to bark, cracking as they molted. They were the most beautiful things I had ever seen. I had read that they were extinct, but now they were just beside me, the Silent Sisters. They ran forward, brandishing clubs that grew from their hands. They created a distraction, but a column of fire had erupted from Aunt Jessie, covering her body from head to toe. "Matt, the vial!" I screamed at him, but he had already downed it before I could finish. His small body spasmed, and Cole ran towards him. The Silent Sisters were beside him already, trying to stop the convulsions. "His body's rejected the potion," one sister said, and the other extended her hand over him. I watched as the vines spread into his body, through his ears and mouth as they tried to stabilize him. Cole's face was teary, and his heart was broken into pieces. I could only watch as the sisters tried to resuscitate him. His magic suddenly flared, and the temperature dropped so fast that the column of fire died down almost immediately. Frost covered the walls and floor, and cold air rushed in from the outside. The wind picked up, and his body floated up in the air until he was standing upright. His body was still in the air, but his eyes were open now. They were an eerie white as he cast a spell that was in a language I had never heard. It was neither English nor Latin, but it had a strange sense of familiarity to my ears. The crown on Aunt Jessie's head appeared on Matt, and an aura of flames covered him, as well as wind circling every inch of his body. He looked like a god, and all I could do was just stare. He glowed from the inside, and I could see his skin re-knitting itself back as beams left his body through his skin that broke. "The truth! Now!" he bellowed, and I felt compelled to say whatever I was feeling. So this was the power of a god. It was so powerful that it took all my willpower not to bow. I wanted to control," she admitted, and I stuffed the urge to rush at her with vines through her heart. She explained how she was always so jealous of my mother and how she had been in the shadows all along. She thirsted for power so much that she wanted to have the phoenix crown, but she had no idea what to do. Her body already started to crumble, ash floating in the cold wind. The power of the goddess was too much to handle for a human who had not transcended it. It had burned her from the inside out, and she was in so much pain, with her screams rending the air. Her face flashed before my eyes one last time, that sweet smile. But when I moved to save her, her body had completely crumbled. Matt said a spell, and the crown on his head folded in on itself, reshaping itself, and the wind carried it to the pedestal that was at the end of the cavern. It was finally over. My heart was broken, and I could never believe that someone so close to me would have wanted my mother dead for power. Cole pulled me into his arms and hugged me while I cried. Chapter 10. The wind wiped my tears gently, and I let out a deep breath. All that was needed was to convince everyone that my mother was innocent. The Silent Sisters had returned to their seed form, and I felt the power that came from them heat me up. The last hour had been a blur, and it felt like my brain was trying to forget the trauma. I had never experienced someone close to me betray the trust I had in them that had taken so much time to build. It all felt so wrong that Aunt Jessie had died just like that. While most parts of me wanted her to die a very painful death, a little part of me understood what she must have been through living in my mom's shadow. But for all it was worth, she was not supposed to have thought up something that could have killed the only parent I had. As I got off the Zephyros wind that Matt had summoned, I ran hastily into the courtroom. My face was filled with tears of anguish as I ran towards the judge. The few people who were there looked at me questioningly, and I heard snickers and bad words thrown at me. But I didn't care. I was sure that I could change the mind of the jury even without evidence. Even if I had, the Laurent family couldn't go unpunished since Aunt Jessie had passed away. But I couldn't allow my mother to be locked up anymore for what she had nothing to do with. "Judge Heavensbury, I plead for objections," I said, trying to get on his good side, even though we had never spoken before. "My mother is here for something she didn't commit," I tried explaining, and there was a hush over the room. Everywhere became deathly silent as I explained the previous encounter I had with my aunt at Mellark Rock. My mother looked at me, flabbergasted. When I was through with my explanation, there were noises about how I was a liar and was only trying to protect my mother. But I just looked ahead at the judge, who believed I was telling the truth. "Is there any concrete evidence of this allegation you just made?" he asked, and I knew I was going to have a problem. There was no way I could have had any evidence because Aunt Jessie crumbled to dust. I was at a loss on what to do when I heard Aunt Jessie's voice loud and clear in the courtroom. Everything she had said was repeated through some unknown speaker, and I was thankful even though I didn't understand what was happening. Arguments broke out, and when the court was finally silent, Judge Heavensbury spoke in a calm, stoic voice. "With the evidence tendered, The convict is hereby discharged without guilt whatsoever, he said, and I jumped for joy with teary eyes. I ran to my mother and gave her the tightest hug ever. But there was a tug in my stomach, and I looked out the window to see Cole and Matt gesturing to me. I'm coming, I said, and walked outside into the late afternoon. My heart was pounding with happiness, and I hugged Cole more than I ever had. It's time to go, Rosalind, said Cole, and I knew that our short time together had come to an abrupt end. But I was glad that they had come when they had, because I couldn't have done it all alone. O magnum ventis ut nos the realm vinde veneremus, Matt whispered, and the air shimmered. It condensed, and a doorway opened out of thin air. So this is goodbye? I said, teary-eyed. Just remember to call this time, he replied with that huge smile, and the tears ran down my face. I pulled him in and kissed him, savoring the taste of his mouth. I wanted him more than I ever did after this big victory we just had, but I knew he couldn't stay. We stayed there for a while, with Matt looking away, embarrassed. I watched as Cole walked into the void with a huge smile on his face. I didn't know that I could have so many feelings all at once. Happiness that my mom was free, and the sadness of losing my aunt and watching Cole and Matt leave to go home. Suddenly, I felt Shadow winding in and out of my legs as I stood thinking about all that had happened. I picked him up and smiled as I gently kissed him on the top of his head. Suddenly, everything in the world was once again where it should be. The end. This has been Hexed and Vexed, a Bailey Bay cozy mystery. Bailey Bay Cozy Mysteries, Book 2. Written by Catherine Waltan. Narrated by Allison Liu. Copyright 2021 by Catherine Waltan. Production copyright by Catherine Waltan.